Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Julia Azari, the author of Backlash Presidents, From Transformative to Reactionary Leaders in American History. This is the second book that she has authored, and she's also a political science professor at Marquette. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Azari.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Periods of racial renewal in America are often followed by an equal or even more powerful reactionary response. Lincoln was followed by Johnson, LBJ was followed by Nixon, and Obama was followed by Trump. Dr. Azari argues that those responses are baked into America's system. Feelings of hope give way to fears that things have gotten out of control, have gone too far. For example, Lyndon Johnson's Civil and Voting Rights Acts gave way to Nixon's silent majorities that yearned for the supposed safety of the suburbs. LBJ's huge 1964 win became a narrow Nixon win in 1968, which led to a George Washington like thumping in 1972. So, uh, Julia, Dr. Azari, is there something in America's Constitution that paves the way or foreshadows this kind of reaction to liberalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Constitution angle is an interesting one. I basically take the position that the Constitution does two things. I deal a little bit with the early period in American history, but mostly, as you said, it's a little more modern. But the Constitution is set up in a way that compromises around the issue of slavery. And does so, and a number of historians and legal scholars have written about this, it does so in a way that gives sort of an advantage, in a way, kind of a veto to the slaveholding states at the inception of the country. So, first is this sort of structure of the Constitution, the Electoral College, the Senate, um, all kind of give power to the states. But the second piece of it is simply how much there isn't in the US Constitution, um, the silences of that Constitution. And in some ways, I think my argument is really rooted in something that is implied in the structure of the Constitution, but really has been an extra constitutional development, which is the idea that the president embodies the face of the nation and the power of the nation. And something really important to my argument is that when the president kind of applies that power of the office to changing the racial status quo and elevating the power of people, specifically of African Americans who've been excluded from certain political powers, that's what sets off these other kind of backlash dynamics.
Before we get on with that, I do want to just mention that AxelbankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page that I mentioned. So definitely go there and check out Nikki's work. You ended up studying the three transitions that I mentioned, Lincoln to Johnson, LBJ to Nixon, and Obama to Trump. How did you settle on those three? And how many potential periods of change did you consider like that? So, for instance, did you consider, let's say, Grant to Hayes or
Mhm.
TR and Taft to Wilson or FDR and Truman to Eisenhower or even Clinton to George W. Bush? Is it merely a
Yeah.
trade between liberals and conservatives, or does it go deeper than that?
So the thing that I really focused on was the impeachment element. So here's how I came up with this book. This is my second book, as you said. After I wrote it, I was already a tenured professor. I had some kind of freedom to be thinking about what am I going to write next. And Donald Trump had just become president. It was the fall of 2017, and I was kind of um, going to some democracy meetings among scholars to kind of talk about American institutions. And I was looking at some popular media comparisons between Trump and Andrew Johnson and Richard Nixon. So this is actually in the wake of Trump firing FBI Director James Comey. And so there was a lot of think pieces out in the world about connecting him to those two presidents in one way or another. And a lot of those comparisons are about temperament. They take into account racism and backlash, but a lot had to do with sort of the attitude toward the executive and what they were like as people. And I thought, well, there's something else here. And that is that all of their predecessors were not only presidents who were racially transformative, but who broke through periods in which presidents have tried very hard to avoid those kinds of upsets. I'd actually kind of gotten to that in the classroom. I'd been teaching the presidents and kind of their efforts to avoid the slavery issue, and then their efforts to avoid the civil rights issue. And I thought, um,
Mm.
something is going on here. And obviously, that looks a little bit different in the post 1964 world, which we can talk a little bit more about. But that was how I was thinking about it, was actually this connection between impeachment and race. And that struck a chord with people. I presented it as kind of like a little short memo think piece, like here's a thing I thought about. And that really struck a chord with people because I think we don't understand impeachment very well. And it both sounds right, but isn't something people have thought about in connection. And it turns out that impeachment is really deeply connected to the racial dynamics of American politics and the presidency.
And if
So
you look
that's
at it,
that's the basic argument.
yeah, and it's amazing that those three presidents, Johnson, Nixon, and Trump, were all either impeached or threatened with impeachment.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, you know, is that did that kind of exclude the potential to studying some of the other time periods that I mentioned?
I mean, they're all covered. The book covers those periods. It what it does is it tells sort of three arcs. It goes from the founding, and after the founding, you have a number of presidents who are slave owners themselves. But more importantly, as the issue heats up, presidents like don't want to have anything to do with it, so they're championing compromises. The between Kansas Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, all these things you learn about in like AP kind of AP history turn out, I think, to be really important to what the presidency is in that period. And then Lincoln is not necessarily a president who wants to be put into this position, but he, as the first Republican president, goes from representing a party that wants to stop the expansion of slavery, which is a big change at the time, to really putting the power of the presidency behind emancipation and the 13th Amendment. And
And
then
you
you have a period, so you mentioned Grant and Hayes, right? That's a period of kind of like what happens now? What is this next period going to look like after Andrew Johnson's impeachment? And the presidency again sort of retreats from the questions of race, retreats from Reconstruction, retreats from trying to enforce the laws of the federal government in the South as it pertains to racial violence. And that period is sort of characterized by that. So it's not just about a transition of political party. Um, it's about a kind of newly racialized moment. And I look at the 1864 election, 1968, and 2016, and how those stand out from the periods that preceded them.
In your view, what qualifies as a period of racial transformation? Is there
Hmm.
sort of a scientific measuring stick that an
Hmm.
academic can use? Is there like a yardstick
Hmm.
to say this president tried to stretch the bounds of what had previously been accepted?
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward in the case of Lincoln, and it's fairly straightforward in the case of Lyndon Johnson. Up until that point, you had mostly had presidents who had really tried to avoid and accommodate the racial structure that they inherited. So particularly in the period leading up to Lyndon Johnson, presidents were really trying not to upset that status quo. I think FDR is maybe one of the best examples of this. FDR was a huge kind of stretcher of executive power, had a very expansive view of what the presidency could do, was very hesitant to upset the southern wing of his party, which was strategic, but was very hesitant to, for example, put the weight of his presidency behind an anti-lynching bill that was being proposed in Congress, and was mostly a kind of perpetuator of the certain elements of the racial status quo. And to the extent his presidency was helpful for African Americans, it was sort of through economic means. That's not nothing, but it's interesting to contrast the way he approached the presidency and virtually everything else with this racial caution. And when you get to Johnson, it's partly Johnson's own kind of view of what he wanted his legacy to be, but it's also that the social movement and the situation has built to a certain point where he's got to be responsive, and you get this legislation that fundamentally changes the relationship between the federal government and the states. And it's a really distinct period. And if you want to talk about this most recent period, I think that one in some ways is the fuzziest, but also the most familiar.
How did you wrestle with that sort of, does the chicken or the egg come first? Is it the president that is the one pushing
Mhm.
things, or is it society that's pushing things?
So I think that's actually pretty settled science um, in the way that people study American political history, which is that these things come from social movements, and presidents are responding to political pressure. But then the question is, or the thing that I think is interesting, is when presidents respond to these political pressures, they there are sort of similar dynamics that happen, which is that they become kind of the face of this transformation, and people understand that all the elements of the presidency, right? This sort of public face, the executive power, the force of the federal government, when all that comes together in the presidency and says, okay, we are now doing something different. Society is going to look different. The way that power flows through society is going to be different. That creates some strong feelings among people who are invested in that racial status quo, and it also puts both parties in a new and questionable position about like how do they position themselves relative to this new thing. And you can really see that struggle taking place um, in our most recent in this most recent iteration of this, where again I think it's fairly straightforward that with Barack Obama being the first African American president, he actually doesn't want, I think, to be transformative in this way.
He got
But
enormous
that's
heat
the
for
way that the
not talking.
politics
I
works.
mean, he got enormous heat for not talking
Mhm,
about it, particularly from,
mhm.
left wing people in his party.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and the Black Lives Matter movement emerged under Obama's presidency with this sort of idea that even when there is an African American in the White House, that we still are facing these problems at the kind of local level. Um, Nevertheless, what I argue there is the period after civil rights, the norm becomes a sort of colorblind norm. You don't talk about race in public. You pretend this has sort of been overcome, and the president talks about everybody equally. That's a big part of being president of all the people. And what's really notable with Obama is that in the times when he did talk more explicitly about race, the remember the Skip Gates arrest, Henry Louis
Yeah,
Gates, the
yeah.
Harvard
And
professor, was
Trayvon
arrested.
Martin, that could have been my
Trayvon
son.
Martin, yes, could yeah. If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. These spur enormous pushback, and there are all these kind of moments that illustrate that what the period leading up to Obama is a period in which the country is quite polarized on race. You see this in a lot of kind of voting data, racial identity, but also racial attitude. Those really become defining of the two political parties. There's a lot of inequality across racial groups. There's a growing diversity in the nation. These things are all happening, but the nation's sort of national political language to discuss it is lacking. And with the person of Obama, it becomes impossible not to talk about race. And so essentially, my chapter on Obama is the country. It's always kind of bumbling around, trying to figure out how do we talk about this, and how do we acknowledge that the president is a person of color, also the president of all the people. Something he said. My book opens with him saying that to an interview with Ebony magazine, and that becomes the question. And you have kind of the Democratic Party trying to figure out how do we balance all of our constituencies, and also the Republican Party going back and forth about, well, how do we react to this? I think there are a number of Republicans who want, I mean, maybe Jeb Bush is an example of this. They want to focus on policy. They don't want to talk about this. They want to keep going on as if everything is normal and oppose Obama much the same way they would have opposed, have President Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton. And then you have other people in the Republican Party who want to capitalize on this backlash, and they have different visions of what that looks like. And in that lack of coordination, right, in that many different Republican perspectives on how to react to the new situation, you have Donald Trump. And he provides something for Republican Party leaders that I think we don't talk about enough, which is that he allows them to capitalize and build on those votes and express that backlash sentiment and kind of appeal to voters who are uncomfortable with Obama, while also distancing themselves because he's not a party insider. And so they can kind of say, oh, he's not one of us. Um, and that is something that Nixon and Andrew Johnson all had in common, is that they were all in a weird way kind of outside of certain elements of their own parties. Nixon was a very experienced politician, but kind of a lifelong, misfit outsider. And that gives parties some space to try and address these backlash dynamics. So that's another commonality across those presidents.
One part of the Trump backlash, maybe the most important part, is that he rose to political prominence by doing these appearances on Fox News, in which his main
Mm-hmm.
issue was questioning President Obama's birthplace.
Mm-hmm.
How important was that in terms of sort of steering this backlash in this direction?
I think it's hard to say precisely what that thing did, but that's absolutely Trump's kind of presidential political origin. And the birther story is an interesting story. I think it sort of exemplifies those racial dynamics because it is obviously racial, and yet at the same time it has this veneer of, it's not about race, it's about where were you born, and we're just asking questions. And so it has this sort of it can work on both of those levels, and it can, even if it has no basis in reality, what it does is it plants this seed of reminding people this is someone who doesn't look like all past presidents and who might represent some kind of shift in power as you have known it before. This should make you nervous. This should make you anxious. This should make you seek out new kinds of politics and new kinds of political solutions.
Clearly, Lincoln, given the changes that were made, the change to the Constitution that outlawed slavery, and then ultimately the 14th and 15th Amendments that came after his passing. Clearly, though, that was the first major period of presidential steered racial transformation in the country. Um, the elephant in the room is that it's 80 years after the first president took office. How do you
Mm-hmm.
characterize those 80 years, and the fact that
Mm-hmm.
it's several generations long? How do we deal with that long, long time
Mm-hmm.
period at the beginning of our country where it seems like there was very little racial
Mm-hmm.
change in terms of who had
Mm-hmm.
power?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of my point, is that um it's really, sorry, there's an airplane
That's okay.
um
We can let it
I live
pass. They
right
go
by,
quickly.
yeah,
500
yeah, I live
miles
right
an
by the
hour above
airport.
our heads.
Yeah. It might happen again though, because I live right in the flight path. Um, yeah. So, I mean, that is kind of part of my point, is we go through these long phases where a lot of things change, where the party system changes, the country changes. Through that period, the country gets much bigger. That pushes at that issue of slavery. And there are, social movements that emerge to try and end slavery. And like, presidents don't want anything to do with that. They're quite cautious. I use the word cautious, and obviously conservative can have a lot of different meanings. I think I use caution so many times in this book. I'm terrified to do a control F search for it. But um that's kind of the through line. And like if you look at the origins of the two parties that led up to 1860, um that's pretty evident. On the one hand, you have the Van Buren-Jackson Democratic coalition that explicitly brings North and South together. And it's Martin Van Buren, who's a Northerner, and who ultimately runs for president as a free soiler. But he's the one who advances the idea in Congress that of this sort of gag rule of keeping in the House of Representatives, keeping slavery related legislation away. It's Jackson who goes after the post office for the mailing of abolitionist material through the mail. They don't want anything to do with this issue. And the Whig Party forms also explicitly around not taking a position on slavery and merging North and South. And so those are the dynamics that by which every president is nominated and elected, and they don't want any part of this. I mean, it's a quirk of US history that Whig presidents who were elected didn't serve for very long, and they all died in office. So, it's
And it
hard
didn't
to
take
know
very
those
long for them to
counterfactuals.
die, actually. Yeah.
Right. Well, and they die. The Whig Party died. Sorry, now you've got me going. I've hit my second cup of coffee, and you've asked me about the Whigs. This is the nightmare scenario. Um, the Whig Party dies because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? And that is another attempt to compromise around the issue of the expansion of slavery that is perceived correctly as a win for the slavery side, allowing new states to decide, new territories to decide for themselves. And that's the formation of the Republican Party here in Wisconsin. And the Republican Party is formed around the idea of ending the expansion of slavery. Even that accommodates a very wide range of views. So you have people like Lincoln who didn't see a way for slavery to end in a constitutional way. And they thought, it may die out naturally, but we're not going to end it through aggressive moves. This is, we're going to respect institutions. And then there were also people in that party who were much deeper into abolitionist thought and ideas. So that's a sort of brief history of pre-Civil War caution. And I think it does unify these wide periods.
I want to ask how you put this all together. How did this book flow out of your previous book, Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate? Can you draw a line between the two of them?
Yeah, a little bit. That's a good question. No one's asked me that question. And there was, as often is the case for academic authors, there's a big gap between the two books. I think that I realized several years after it came out, Delivering the People's Message came out in 2014, that it didn't deal with the role of race in elections nearly as much as it should have. So in some ways, it's a corrective. It's a corrective to that. It also, it got me thinking about the justification for presidential power and the way presidents think about their coalitions. And so in that sense, I think it built on that. But in a lot of ways, they're really distinct projects. Um, and the second book, how did I pull it all together? It was a lift. I'm not a 19th century or early Republic historian, so I spent a lot of time getting up to speed on those periods and then thinking about how they fit in with the long period between the Civil War and civil rights. That's even longer and more complicated. And then how it fits into this third period, which is really where the issues are less clear cut than in the first two, and a lot of what I'm dealing with is much more in the realm of ideas than in the realm of legal and policy change.
Hmm. What sources did you use for this book? How did you put this all together? What did you do to attach your argument to different
Mhm.
source material?
Yeah, another good kind of research question. So I started this book, as I said, I had the idea in 2017. I committed to the idea of writing it as a book in 2020. During the period between the 2020 election and January 6th, as I watched people try to sort of fumble around and compromise, I decided to write this as a book. And I read a lot about the Civil War during that period because I was at home with no social life. And so I had to design a book I could write. It wasn't clear at that point when the archives would reopen. So I had to design a book that I could write with all library books. Um, and I really am very lucky to be at a university that has a fantastic library. So I used secondary sources. I used some quite a bit of newspaper accounts. A lot of what I've written about Richard Nixon is actually not part of many standard accounts of Nixon. I don't know that there are too many books about the Nixon impeachment. I didn't find any that really dig into the racial dynamics. So that was where I really dug into some newspaper sources and some things that are some archival sources online. But it's largely I read a gazillion books. You couldn't walk in my home office. I think the book has something like 800 footnotes. But it is really synthesizing a lot of research other people have already done and putting it together to what I want to do is for people to think about American political history in a new way. And also, I think to think about the linkage between presidential lawlessness, the way we think about Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Donald Trump, and their sort of um, transgressions against what we understand as rule of law, their using of the executive branch for their own political purposes. I want us to understand that as linked to the politics of race.
Hmm. One of the pieces that you wrote for the Washington Post describes how President Obama went on Zach Galifianakis's show to cultivate this idea that he was funny and less
Mm-hmm.
formal and that he could just kind of
Mm-hmm.
be like an everyman. It's like sort of an early
Mm-hmm.
podcast, actually.
Mm-hmm.
That preceded this podcast by 6 years. You say that's a critical turning point that that piece was
Mm-hmm.
written in 2014. So how do the following 11 years, believe it or not, since that it feels like it
Mm-hmm.
was yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
11 years, how do the following
Yeah.
11 years, especially given Donald Trump's two totally unconventional presidencies, where we're treated to hourly videos of him, and they post videos of all kinds of the president, doing different things that we didn't
Mm-hmm.
used to see presidents doing. How did the following 11 years impact your view of that moment that you felt was significant in 2014,
Mm-hmm.
but now clearly it foreshadowed a whole different level of the type of
Mm-hmm.
experience we all have following politics?
Yeah, I think it's, there are a lot of people who've written about kind of the president. There's a book called The Ubiquitous President, for example, right? They've written
I
about sort
had
of
that.
saturation.
I had that
You
book.
had that? Okay.
I think I had him on. Is it Josh Scacco?
Yeah,
Is that
Joshua
who?
Sacco. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. I had him on. I've had him on the show to
Okay,
talk
great.
about
Yeah.
that book.
So yeah, they're great. And Kevin Coe. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people have written about this, maybe more in a communications lens about like the accessibility of the president. Um, I actually think my thoughts I have that I think are slightly more interesting are actually about the format itself. And I've thought a lot about this relative to Obama, going on Zach Galifianakis. I've written a couple pieces about his sort of use of casual language, the time he called Kanye West a jackass.
Hmm.
Um, Also about the comments that led up to the beer summit where he said the Cambridge police acted stupidly. You have these moments where essentially what you're doing with those types of formats is you're making the president seem more ordinary and casual and almost kind of developing a parasocial relationship with the president. And what that does is it really scrambles up how we think about power. And what I think Obama kept finding out is that when he kind of crossed over that line and actually talked like a normal person, like if I go on this podcast and I call someone a jackass, like no one's gonna care, right? If someone who made a rude comment about one of my papers at a
Oh, with the
conference, they
massive
might care.
following that this podcast has, there's going to be a lot of people who care. No, I'm kidding.
Who care? There,
Mm.
there's me a number of people who are like, who, what, right? But like, it's me. It's not the podcast. It's me, right? No one cares what a normal citizen has to say. But but if I said that about one of my students, someone would care because there's a power relationship there. And when the president of the United States speaks in that sort of casual way, in a way that bumps up against that power, that makes fun of someone or calls someone a jackass, and it really um causes some discomfort. And so that's what I think we see with that kind of format is it sort of like plays with that power dynamic. And I think Trump does that in a very different way because he's ubiquitous, but he doesn't really do like I'm just doing an ordinary thing kind of appearance, right? And he's usually in a, in his tie and suit and everything. But he is accessible everywhere and he does, speak his mind about private citizens. And I think in some ways Obama opened the door to that. And a lot of my academic colleagues don't like it when I say that, but I think it's true. Um, and that's where I think we have this weird moment in the presidency where the media environment is constantly trying to make the president accessible, ordinary presence, and the office has like never been less of any of those things, right?
The clip there's a clip that just went viral of President Obama playing around with what was new at the time, a selfie stick. He got
Hmm.
hammered for that, and I'd forgotten when that whole dust up started. but the clips of the different media outlets ripping him for doing that and kind of uh, dousing the presidency or rendering the presidency less prestigious because of that selfie stick are really kind of telling. And just today, it's been revealed, I think, that the UFC fighters are going to be walking from the Oval Office onto the ring to have the fight in the UFC front lawn. That would have been an unthinkable thing that would have been done 10 years ago under the Obama presidency.
Yeah, I mean, probably. And there's a tension between this sort of dignity of the office that the office itself requires and the ordinariness and accessibility that democracy requires. And I mean, we kind of have dealt with this forever in the presidency. I think different presidents have sort of thought about this in different ways, and modern media makes it way more complicated, but I don't think it creates the dilemma.
Mm.
Um, and it's just a sort of unresolvable dilemma about what do you do when you have this really powerful office in a democracy, and how do you kind of create this performance of accessibility? And with Obama, I think there was a conscious level of that because his presidency was racialized. So one thing he would kind of have to do would be to sort of ratchet it down, emphasize his ordinariness, his accessibility, his calmness. And then when he did things that were sometimes I don't want to, I don't really have a position on whether, there are things he should or shouldn't have done, but he did things that maybe, were out of the norm in one way or another. And then that invited some media criticism. With Trump, I think it's a little different. I just wrote a piece for The Conversation that sort of touches on this. Um, with Trump, I think it's almost always to make a cultural point. It's almost always to entrench his position as the main articulator of the kind of cultural position of his movement, which is, I think, dominant in the Republican Party, but not the same thing as. So it's always about, it's not an accident that it's UFC, right? It's not women's lacrosse. In that position. And that so I think that's in that sense both Trump and Obama are very distinct presidents from what we've seen in the past, but in very different ways.
Talk about style here with your book. You mentioned you're an
Mhm.
academic historian. How should authors connect with audiences, and how did you try
Mhm.
to connect with an audience in this age of 3 second scrolling?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. Yeah, I'm a political scientist, so we're actually probably even more um, inaccessible than historians in a lot of ways. You know, I'm I'm a weird case because I had written on the internet nearly constantly in between that period in between when my two books came out. I wrote, several hundred blog posts and pieces at 538 and other of those types of outlets. And not all academics want or need to do that work. Um, but I had a lot of sort of encouragement from my editors at Princeton to write this in a way that would be interesting to normal people. I have yet to receive any feedback about whether that's the case. But
Whether it worked.
uh, given a few months, um, but a big part of that was just to tell this as a story and to try and find anecdotes that would bring out the human dynamic. And I don't really do this in a way that's like very touchy-feely. I don't really describe what people, were wearing or whatever. Um,
The
but to
weather,
try and
yeah,
tell,
the weather, yeah, the
yeah,
clothes, yeah.
I'm just not that person. But instead I try to tell the story of kind of like what were the people involved doing. And like it turns out I think power dynamics are very interesting if you can capture them, right? Um, about who's trying to get power in a given room or given situation, what are the different sources of conflict. Like conflict makes for a good story. But really for me, a lot of it was like tell the story in a chronological way, try to, edit out language. Mostly it's editing and editing and editing. Edit out language that isn't accessible, um, make your sentences shorter, and not, I use other scholarly work, obviously, but not engage in those debates for the sake of them. And I had a lot of experience at 538 because we wrote for a very elevated audience, but not necessarily an academic one. What I'm doing when I write for a public audience is to invite people who haven't necessarily gotten a PhD in the subject into the most important debates in the field and kind of say, here's what group of scholars X say, and here's scholars Y, and you're now invited to sort of, weigh the logic and that evidence in a way that's digestible, as opposed to explaining it to people. I'm inviting them in.
Let's go back to the content a little bit here. I want to ask about the three presidents that you're focusing on,
Mhm.
Lincoln, Johnson, and Obama, and then the byproduct of
Mhm.
that being Johnson and Nixon and Trump. So the first thing I just want to ask about is Lincoln. When
Mhm.
it comes to the racial transformation, just explain. I mean, some of it may be self-evident, if I may say, but how exactly did he steer a racial transformation, and what were the particulars that sort of
Mhm.
uncorked this genie from the bottle?
Yeah, so there's a couple of key elements with Lincoln. The first being, of course, that he doesn't want this role. He doesn't want to be nearly as transformative as he is. And he's,
Right. If I could
you
save
know,
the union by doing this, I would do it. If I could save the union by doing that, I would do that too.
right, exactly. And so it turns out when you scratch the surface, there's a whole body of work in the academic historical literature about, how saving the Union had to be about freeing the slaves, and there's, all sorts of ins and outs of that. So I try to sort of digest the key parts of that for readers. And then I focus on three elements of his presidency that fundamentally upended the racial status quo. And again, as you said, it's fairly obvious. These are not going to blow you away. Um, it's the Emancipation Proclamation, which uses presidential war power to emancipate the slaves. And so that is in some ways, like a really raw way of using, here is a unilateral presidential power in a time of war to do something that is sort of realizes the fears of white supremacists, which is, putting former slaves into the military, into the service for the Union, handing weapons to them, putting weapons in their hands. So that is a huge reversal of the kind of, understanding of power among individuals and its use of presidential power. Then it's the Gettysburg Address, which sort of redefines what the Civil War is about. So it becomes not just about saving the Union, it's still about that, but it is about this new birth of freedom. It is about it, it fundamentally kind of identifies we're going to have a second founding, and this is about equality, and this is about something. And so it's using that rhetorical power of the presidency, much more limited in Lincoln's time, but still important. And that's the championing of the 13th Amendment and the change of the Constitution. So those are kind of the Lincoln stories. And of course the Lincoln story is cut short. And the rise of Andrew Johnson to the presidency is a little bit different than Nixon and Trump because he's the vice president. But that's the Lincoln story in a
And
nutshell.
how much, and how does Andrew Johnson steer this backlash? Where does the backlash come from? Does it come from the people or does it come from him?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think hard to say definitively, but certainly it's happening throughout the South. Um, and again, it's a different backlash than what we see later. It's much more violent. Um, but Andrew Johnson's a very strange figure. He is selected as Lincoln's vice president in 1864 out of political caution, out of hope to loyal, um, keep loyal kind of war skeptics in the party, to appeal to loyal Southerners. So Johnson was from Tennessee. He was a loyal Southerner, and he hated slavery, but he was, had deeply racist beliefs and really wanted, as president, to kind of reconstitute the racial structure of slavery without the economic power that slave owners held. And that
That
was
was
he had this sort of populist objection to slavery. Yeah.
like he hated slavery, but he was sympathetic to the slave owners.
Yeah. Yeah. And he was sympathetic to this sort of racial hierarchy that it represented. He hated the economic power that it concentrated in slave owners.
How did that
It's
backlash then begin to steer the country towards the end of Reconstruction, which is, of course, a devastating moment
Hmm.
in American history.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of people, myself among them, think we're, in some ways we're sort of still contending with those issues. Um, so that primarily has to do with the enforcement of Reconstruction, right? Of the commitment of federal troops to protecting African Americans against this violence that's taking off in the South. So you have freed people, and then you have incredible mob violence against them. I draw on a lot of different sources in this, but I drew quite a bit on a book that came out in 2020 called The Impeachers about Andrew Johnson that sort of goes into this. Um, and Johnson was really, I think a person of great personal and political grievance. He goes around on a speaking tour and talks about how, how persecuted he is, how his critics in Congress, the radical anti-slavery Republicans, should be hanged. There's this sort of like grievance political tour, and at the time that's really not done to go on a speaking tour, and that really aggravates his opponents. And then ultimately the thing that it gets people to impeach him, they sort of know that he's not enforcing um Reconstruction bills that Congress is passing. He's vetoing these kind of post-Civil War bills that are intended to kind of restructure life for formerly enslaved people. There's sort of this sense among his political opponents that this person is not upholding his constitutional obligation. He's not enforcing the laws. He's not protecting all the people. You can't really build a case for impeachment around this sort of feeling of ick. This happens in all three of the cases I look at. It's like there's this feeling of ick that is rooted in race, rooted in the sense that the president isn't upholding their responsibility. And then you have to look for some discrete charges. And for Johnson, that is his 1866 speaking tour and this sort of haranguing of Republican legislators, and also primarily his firing of Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War. And there's a kind of complicated legal history to that, but ultimately what that is about the prosecution of Reconstruction. That is about the enforcement of Reconstruction. Um, and so that's the Johnson story.
Just by the way, as I ask this next question, if you hear a 4-year-old in the background, she's just going wild with her grandparents right now, and her grandparents are going wild with her. So forgive
Amazing.
me. Yeah.
I hear
Um,
nothing.
okay, perfect. I'm not hearing nothing right now, but I'm gonna keep going. The particulars of LBJ's racial
Yeah.
transformation. Or at least the transformation that he steered politically, at least, of course, not the movement, but the political aspects he steered. The changes are massive. The Civil Rights Act,
Mhm.
it's now illegal to segregate. It's now illegal to deprive somebody of an education. Um, uh,
Yeah.
the Voting Rights Act, it's now illegal to say that someone can't vote because of their race, and we're also going to put mechanisms in to make sure that those who don't have representation are going to have that representation. How big of a deal is that? Is that transformation? I mean, just given the fact that up until a few years ago, the Civil Rights Act was not touched legally in this country for
Mhm.
decades.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. Um, it as I said, it changes the relationship between the states and the federal government. It changes in some ways, it sort of highlights the the exceptionalism of the South. Um, these are bipartisan legislation, bills that are passed, and that, to be clear, they're not just about the South. These things are happening everywhere, but it creates this narrative of kind of Southern grievance, and those are the first states to really, defect from that, from the Democratic coalition. That creates that opportunity for Richard Nixon. And that creates, again, like the narratives of grievance are really important to my story, because I think it's in those narratives of grievance that presidents find license to go beyond the accepted boundaries of their of their presidencies is when they are thinking, well, I'm acting on behalf of aggrieved Americans, and this is what my project is. Um, the Voting Rights Act. So I focus on the Voting Rights Act in particular because of its relationship to political power, and because of this idea that it's so important who is going to have political power at any given at any given moment. But it's interesting that you bring up education as well, because that is what's sort of going on in the decade leading up to Lyndon Johnson is the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision comes down while in 1954 while Eisenhower is president. Eisenhower was not a hateful person. He was not an opponent of civil rights. He was very cautious in all regards. Um, he was not happy that this came down while he was president. He had to figure out how to enforce it. And some of that came down to the understanding of the proper role of the federal government in the states. How do you assert this federal role when education has been the purview of the states? That's the formal dimension. The informal dimension, and something that Eisenhower did talk about, was this idea that now you're really pushing people to integrate socially in some sense, and you're really changing how people live in this area where people are very, it's very explosive with school children. And Eisenhower expressed some sympathy for that view among Southern segregationists. But the bigger point for my argument is it's just like presidents don't want to touch this. Kennedy didn't either. That this is a really heavy lift for presidents to try and get involved in how people live in a more day-to-day way and push at this state federal question that I think really shows the limits of this very otherwise quite powerful modern presidency. And it's quite stunning when you juxtapose it against the sort of Cold War presidency and its expansiveness. Um, and so Johnson is leading up to all of that, making an affirmative case for civil rights and for really examining the problems of our history. And he says, this is legislation, but we are actually going to have to do this work in our social context to really make it real. And to hear that from an American president is a huge transformation of the kind of, all of society. And that spurs significant backlash among people who are invested in that previous status quo.
How did Nixon's silent majority take root,
Mhm.
and how did that steer a cultural revolution?
So here's what makes Nixon interesting. A lot of things make Nixon interesting. Um, Nixon does not cut exactly the same kind of figure as Trump and Johnson. And Nixon is running in 1968. I mean, he tries to present himself as more moderate, and even sometimes sympathetic to civil rights claims. Um, Nixon is running in 1968 against Democrat Hubert Humphrey with a long civil rights record and who's the sitting vice president of Lyndon Johnson, but also against George Wallace, who is this, Southern segregationist populist and is really appealing to people in the South, but also not entirely in the South. Um, and Nixon steers this middle course. He also does that in the nomination. He steers sort of middle course between Nelson Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan. Um, so Nixon exploits this middle way opportunity. And what he does there is he brings the language of backlash into a kind of more normal discourse. So he talks about law and order. He talks about crime. He talks about disorder. And all of this is very much, a direct response in some ways to Lyndon Johnson saying, hey, society is going to have to change. And everyone knows that's not going to be easy, and it's not easy, right? And you have these, urban unrest incidents in the late 60s, push back against the 1968 Act Fair Housing, which again really gets people literally where they live. And Nixon kind of says, we're going to proceed lawfully, but with caution. And we need to really, think about whether we want to invite this kind of social disorder. And so he brings it all into much more of a mainstream, right? Talking about a silent majority. When he talks about a silent majority, he says they're not they're not reactionary. These are just ordinary people who don't want life to change that much. And that's a very broadly appealing message, and it's also a message that you can hear, at different registers. And that's how Nixon, I think, really brings together this coalition that puts, in some ways, like what I would call a very socially reactionary set of ideas into a very kind of innocuous mainstream sounding language.
how will the country respond to 10 years of domination of Trumpism? And I don't mean that in a necessarily negative way.
Mhm,
The word
mhm.
domination, I just mean it's clear that he has steered politics since the moment he came down that escalator in 2015. So where is the country going from here? How do we,
Where is the country going?
I don't know. This is what you're here for. What
Where is it going? Good question.
Yeah. What is going to be the reaction to 10 years of this sort of backlash what's the reaction to the reaction, I guess is the
Mhm,
question.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, so I will say two things at the outset. One is I did not particularly anticipate this reality. Um, I don't know why, probably because I live in an urban area and was surrounded by, Harris posters, but I thought, okay, the lift here is going to be me describing what will be similar and different between a Harris presidency and Obama. Um, and I spent the summer and fall of 2024 writing a bunch of stuff I had to throw out. Um, but where we are now is actually sort of, similar to where this normally goes. So what I describe in these post impeachment periods is that this sort of like the transformative party, whether it's Lincoln's Republicans or LBJ's Democrats, backs off. They have other issues they want to deal with. They don't want anything to do with um this kind of intensity, and the reactionary party doubles down. And so that's where you get, Jim Crow recreates a lot of the elements of slavery, and you get this sort of, a period dominated by Ronald Reagan. We haven't talked about it at all, but he was quite an important figure in this story.
Hmm.
Um, that really doubles down on colorblind politics, anti-affirmative action, uses personnel in the Justice Department to scale back on aggressive forms of civil rights enforcement. And that kind of backlash, the backlash become, backlash takes hold, the transformation takes a backseat. And what I think is happening now is some element of that, obviously, but also that it's a different situation because the Democratic Party is different now. And so Jimmy Carter could run in 1976 and say, I'm moderate and not really have a ton to say about civil rights, not really have a civil rights program. I think Joe Biden and the Biden-Harris administration was cut from a different cloth, and they were poised to sort of keep pushing at some of these more transformative politics because that's what the Democratic coalition is going to demand. With parties being a lot more sorted now, more sort of distinct from each other ideologically, that it's a different period. And so I think that one possibility for the country is that we're going to continue to seesaw between sort of close elections between wildly different perspectives, and those perspectives will be largely informed not only by race, but also by these questions of immigration and gender and LGBTQ issues. I think all of these things are related, but I think that issue has sort of expanded to take on new dimensions.
And we've taken up more of your time than we'd planned on, but it's such a fun conversation. So we're just going to keep going for a few. I have a few more questions here.
Sure.
What
Yeah.
should readers do with this thesis? What do you want people who read this book, who may not be academic historians, who may not spend their whole life writing pieces and thinking about this? What do you want people to do with this book to inform, not only inform their own lives,
Mhm.
but to better understand what's happening around them?
Yeah, what I want people to do is to start looking at decisions that leaders make in terms of either affirming the way that power already works or challenging it. Instead of just thinking about the red team and the blue team, but to think about, okay, who currently holds power in my estimation? And people may disagree. Um, And how does this change that or entrench it? And I think that that is something people can really understand and grapple with. I think that something we need to talk about a lot more in our society is how we spread power around among lots of different groups, among lots of different ordinary people, and not let a few people concentrate it. Um, and I think that that is something actually that can accommodate liberal and conservative perspectives. And I think that that comes out of this. And I think the other thing is not to shy away from difficult issues. I think there's a tendency to say, well, race divides us. Talking about it makes everybody uncomfortable. We should just avoid it. And I think the lesson of my book is that it doesn't work. It leads to these boiling points, and we can make different and better choices, and we can confront difficult issues in a way that is peaceful and direct and uncomfortable, but we're not going to die of discomfort. We may, die of violence and even of, excessively concentrated power, but we're not going to die of discomfort. And I think that that's one of the main takeaways I want people to have, is to have a little bit of agency for to not repeat this pattern.
After a period of backlash, it does seem like there are decades and decades until we get to another period of racial transformation. Um, in the meantime, um, how can people work to better their communities and make life better for the people around them?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think there's infinite examples of that. But I think it does again kind of come back down to this question of, well, what are the sources in people's lives that kind of alienate them from having control over their own lives? This is the thing I would, if I were going to graduate school now, I would want to write about workplaces, about food insecurity, about time. Um, how do we help other people in our lives have more of a sense of control over their own lives? I think that the sense that we don't control our own destiny is what's actually underlying a lot of our political crisis. And it's easy in that situation, if you feel like you don't have control in your life, to scapegoat somebody else, and that makes people vulnerable to racist appeals, among other things. And that's, I think, on a more daily basis, I think, well, if you write a check to a food bank or spend an hour there, that helps someone not be hungry, which gives them a little bit more power over their day, and to kind of think about all those pieces in the chain of that's a mixed metaphor, I'm sorry.
No, it's a great.
That's kind of how I think about those connections.
What do you have you decided if you're going to do another book and what that book might be about? Do you already have the seeds for a new one?
Yeah, this book is about such a long period of time. um I think what I'm going to write about next, I'm working on a book on the vice presidency, actually, with another colleague of mine, on a kind of relationship between vice presidents and political parties. And I think if I do another solo book, it's going to be about the legacy of George W. Bush. I'm ready to write about one thing. And I think that there is again, an interesting kind of story about the political parties, and we now have enough historical distance to really contemplate that. So that's my my kind of horizon, but I haven't done any serious work yet.
I'm an advocate in more books on George W. Bush. I think we need more of them.
Really?
Yeah. And it's been a long time since books have come out about him. So
Hmm.
I'm eager to read your vice presidency book and your George W. Bush book. Um, who is your dedication to in this book and why?
Yeah, my dedication is to my parents. Um, Sorry, my dad passed away during the writing of the book.
Mm, wow. Well, that's powerful. I guess I never know what I'm going to ask. I'm sorry, I never know what I'm going to get when I ask that question. And that's as good an answer as any. It seems certainly fitting and appropriate.
Yes, to my knowledge, my parents are the only people who have a shelf of my writing in their house. So yeah,
Yeah, can't beat that. Dr. Azari, Dr. Julia Azari, thanks so much for being here. The author of Backlash Presidents, From Transformative to Reactionary Leaders in American History. Thanks so much.
thank you.
AxelBankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, featured episodes, and also a link to our Patreon page. As always, we donate a part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy, so check out the website and also Nikki's work. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.